Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Ash Sarkar. Ash, before the clock struck 6 p.m., we were discussing our favourite Christmas songs. Gary rudely cut us off. What were you
I
saying?
know. Well, before that act of journalistic censorship took place, Index for Censorship will be all over that, Gary. I was saying that All I Want for Christmas is too big to be your favorite Christmas song. It's like saying Earth is your favorite planet, right? It's simply too gargantuan to say, oh, it's my favorite Christmas song. So excluding that, I've got to say, is that Feliz Navidad,
Oh,
that one. Because you've got your Feliz Navidad, then it's the like, I wanna wish you a Merry Christmas, which is great.
yeah, two languages, two for one. Gorgeous.
See,
I was singing Driving Home for Christmas just before we went live, but I don't know enough of the words to do it while we're on air. Tonight, we're going to talk about a Czech billionaire taking over Royal Mail. There's a new conspiracy theory involving milk. They just keep coming around. This one is quite interesting. It's actually, the truth of it is a good news story. It is tech to try and solve the climate problem, something I'm very into. We'll also discuss whether CNN has been caught out spreading misinformation in Syria, and potentially by accident, were they duped? Stay tuned for all of that. First, though, you know what I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask you to get that festive feeling. Think about whether you want to support your favorite media organization to continue to expand. Yes, if you are already a regular supporter, thank you so much. You make all of this possible. If not, please do go to novaramedia.com/support. Our traditional ask is for 1 hour's wage a month, but whatever you can afford, we really, really do appreciate it. It's what keeps the lights on in Novara Towers. We don't have a tower, don't worry. We're actually very frugal. But do go to novaramedia.com/support. Let's go into our first story. The royal family's disgraced spare, Prince Andrew, is back in the headlines, but this time it doesn't involve underage girls or paedophile billionaire friends. Instead, it's about his long friendship with an alleged Chinese spy. Named today as Yang Tengbo, the Chinese businessman linked to Prince Andrew has said he did nothing wrong over his relationship with the royal, and Yang also denies being a spy for China, claiming he's the victim of the political climate as tensions between China and the UK grow. So he said this: when relations are good and Chinese investment is sought, I am welcome in the UK. When relations sour, an anti-China stance is taken and I am excluded. The story came to light earlier this month after Yang appealed a 2023 decision by then Home Secretary Suella Braverman to bar him from the country. The appeals court found that Braverman had been right to ban him, saying she was entitled to find that he represented a risk to the national security of the United Kingdom. And it's because that court case has now ended that the media have been able to report on Prince Andrew's latest awkward associate. Of course, it's not clear that being friends with Prince Andrew is going to get you anywhere near sort of any very important state secrets. I'm not sure many people do confide in Prince Andrew with such things. But Yang's connections to the royal do seem to have got him access to some actually important people. This was him pictured with former Prime Minister David Cameron and his wife Samantha. And he also managed to meet Cameron's successor, Theresa May, along with her husband, Philip. The theory appears to be that Yang, who met Andrew in around 2015, was trying to run a so-called elite capture operation. That's a process that tries to appoint high-profile people to Chinese businesses, think tanks, or universities with the aim of later leveraging them for political interference. Now, if that's true, Yang may have settled on Andrew not just because the prince's judgment is famously bad, but because he was also isolated as well as desperate for status and money after being disowned by the royal family over rape allegations and a disastrous Newsnight interview in 2019. Andrew later went all but broke after paying a reported $12 million settlement to Virginia Giuffre in 2022 after she accused him of raping her as a 17-year-old. As one expert said in the appeals hearing, a major tool of interference is to create dependency on Chinese funding. And it's widely known that Andrew has no problem being bankrolled by the internationally dodgy super rich from Jeffrey Epstein himself, the oligarch. The oligarch son-in-law of a former Kazakhstan president. Andrew also gave Yang the authority to act on his behalf in China, with this 2021 letter from the prince's senior advisor having been found on Yang's phone. I also hope that it is clear to you where you sit with my principal and indeed his family. You should never underestimate the strength of that relationship. Outside of his closest internal confidants, you sit at the very top of a tree that many, many people would like to be on. Under your guidance, we found a way to get the relevant people unnoticed in and out of the house in Windsor. It's not clear who those relevant people were. It's also not known to what extent Andrew's and Yang's friendship actually posed a security threat, though MI5 has alleged that Yang is connected to the United Front Work Department, an arm of the Chinese Communist Party tasked with conducting influence operations. That connection has given China hawks in the government a chance to harden our relationship with the world's second largest economy, or a chance to push for a hardening. The Times reports that Keir Starmer has come under increasing pressure to designate China a threat to the UK, with banks and businesses warning against the economic impact of such a move. And in Parliament, former Tory leader Ian Duncan Smith raised an urgent question on China and national security.
The Interparliamentary Alliance on China, IPAC, found that H6, Hemming-Bow, has already been well known as a United Front member and is known to others who are already now deep in the political establishment. Parliamentarians are exposed to the United Front as well on a regular basis. So will the Minister remedy that today and accept now that China is our most prominent security threat and all action must take priority?
So he was calling him H6 there because this Yang Tengbo fellow hadn't been named by then. He was only named this afternoon. So that's why he was referring to him by that alias. And the fallout from Prince Andrew's latest dodgy dealings could be pretty serious. But don't worry, Andrew's getting his own punishment. The royal family have now banned their weakest link from joining them for Christmas lunch next week. Ash, I suppose your job as a spy, not that, obviously this guy's denying he's a spy. I'm not an expert on who is or isn't a spy. But hypothetically, your job as a spy is to find the weakest link in a sort of foreign establishment, someone who you can cling on to and get invited to places of influence, and someone who's potentially, somewhat credulous when it comes to believing stories. Prince Andrew, I think he was a trade attaché for a while, wasn't he? This is a guy who is there's just these sirens ringing. I am, come to me, I will get you into sort of important places, and I have no clue what your intentions are. I just want to hang out with someone who might seem important and who flatters me.
Well, if you're looking for a weak link, you often can't go wrong with the second son in a royal family because they are born close to power, but not really that close in line to it. They're constantly looking for status, and one of the things that's screamingly obvious about the royal family is that they are to each other a competitive nest of vipers. So their job is to protect a deeply unfair and inherent unfair institution, but they're also constantly fighting and sniping like rats in a sack. The thing that's interesting to me about the royal family, and in particular, the diminished status, by which I mean the sort of politically diminished, constitutionally diminished status of the royal family, is that it appears to have turned them into some very grubby people. So their role seems to operate, seems to be to operate as a backdoor to the British state. So, on the one hand, you've got Prince Andrew. His close friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, of course, needs very little elaboration of why that was so grubby. Jeffrey Epstein is somebody who surrounded himself by very, very powerful individuals and was able to kind of play this society role by, being the money man, and also allegedly in terms of its involvement of other people, being at the center of a sex trafficking ring, which allegedly fed the appetites of other wealthy and very powerful men as well. But more than that, you've had the allegations that Prince Charles accepted cash from a Saudi businessman, cash towards his charitable foundation, and the quid pro quo was going to be helping this Saudi businessman receive a knighthood and possibly British citizenship as well. Similarly, you had reports which emerged that Prince Charles, when he was a prince obviously and not our king, had accepted 3 million euros in a bag from the former Prime Minister of Qatar. So there seems to be something going on there, which is on the surface, what you've got is an image that the royal family likes to present of themselves, which is the eternal and dignified face of the British state, who are of a higher morality and occupy a higher set of standards than ourselves, and they've got all these charitable endeavors, and that's their service. That's how they serve the public, by both embodying the state in this sort of timeless way, and also by doing all these charitable endeavors. And then you look at the ways in which these charities allegedly operate as a reputation laundering scheme for individuals to sort of, catapult themselves to the top of British society and the heart of society by paying into these charitable endeavours. You go, well, this looks like a really quite grubby set of operations. So even the ways in which the royal family like to justify their existence, which is primarily in the modern era through charity, I mean, you take a peek under the carpet and it looks disgusting in terms of its financial dealings, to say least. To say less of the sexual allegations which have dogged Prince Andrew.
The interesting thing here, I think, I mean, there are many interesting things, but one of them is, the controversy around Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell wasn't just that, maybe Prince Andrew had been involved in, well, I mean, it was rape that he was accused of, right? But there's also a theory about the whole sort of grim affair that it was a honey trap, and that Epstein and Maxwell were working for intelligence agencies. Widely reported that Robert Maxwell, so Ghislaine Maxwell's dad, was very close to Mossad. So there were lots of theories that sort of, it wasn't just that Jeffrey Epstein was a very powerful person, networked with powerful people who happened to be a paedophile, but that he was sort of this whole sordid ring that he was part of was actually a honey trap operation to try and get compromat on important, significant people, so that could be used by an intelligence agency. And obviously that was always a somewhat subversive theory as to what went on. That wasn't something you sort of read in the BBC. You did get it in some tabloids. Obviously our friends at True and On, and we had them on the show to talk about that. That's really what they were always digging into in their early podcast, the idea that this didn't all quite add up. No one really knows where Jeffrey Epstein got all of that money from. Still very much unexplained. So if he were out there to try and spend this money in such a way as to create a sort of influence ring, that could have been plausible. And so the idea that Prince Andrew now seems to be at the center of another spying operation or influence operation, I would say not necessarily completely unconnected. I mean, I don't know what the connection would be to this guy and that particular ring, but the idea that if you are someone involved in intelligence, Prince Andrew is a really great target because he's very well connected by birth, but a complete idiot in terms of his judgment.
Temperament,
His judgment, his temperament, etc., etc. Do you think this could reopen some of those questions that I don't think we quite got to the bottom of when it came to Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, and Prince Andrew?
well, and part of the reason why is because there is a sort of understood compact between establishment media and the intelligence services in terms of don't probe too much, particularly when it comes to the BBC and the operations of British intelligence services. But there's also a culture of deference when it comes to the royal family. Now, when it comes to sex and relationships, that deference has been punctured in the tabloid era. I mean, Charles and Diana, Fergie and Andrew, those were really, really key moments for the transformed culture around that. But the role that the royal family actually plays, so not just talking about the public face and the ribbon cuttings, but the way in which that sort of wider social network, brings money in, and brings all these individuals from, both British society, but also countries abroad as well, and brings them into contact with one another, and the ways in which different agendas, including potentially the agendas of other countries, you know, security services. That's exactly the kind of thing which British media won't cover because it takes too adversarial and hostile a relationship to the British state itself. I mean, the royal family are still seen as the embodiment of the British state. Constitutionally, that's what the sovereign is. As for the honey trap element of Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking ring, that is something which I find plausible. And there's an interesting parallel here. Of course, this is operating in a very different kind of sphere with the Sean Combs P. Diddy allegations. So if you look at the indictment and the fact that he's being tried under so-called RICO powers, what is being alleged, which of course Sean Combs denies, what's being alleged is that the sexual abuse, the coercion of people into sex acts, and the alleged blackmailing and threats of violence, is that these weren't sort of incidental features of, P. Diddy's alleged, personal life. These weren't just an expression of sexual peccadillos, but these were core to how he made his money and how he preserved his power within the music industry. So the allegations are that these rapes, these instances where people were unable to consent, also part of the purpose of them wasn't just for the personal sexual satisfaction of Sean Combs, but was also to have blackmail material and to force people into doing his bidding, and also to cultivate an aura of scariness, which preserved and built up Diddy's position within the music industry itself. So it's entirely plausible to me if these are the allegations regarding someone who is clearly not a head of state, not close to a head of state, doesn't serve a state purpose in any way. If these are the kinds of allegations that you're seeing about the music industry, it is completely plausible to me that sex trafficking and compromat forms part of the sort of tactical portfolio of security services, whether it's Mossad or anybody else.
I presume I should say that Sean Combs denies all those allegations, even though I have to say I'm not on top of that story, but I imagine he would. Interestingly as well, why the media going harder on this story and they didn't when it came to Mossad connections? Well, maybe it's because China is now, an enemy of the state, and they're less inclined to do it when it's an ally who might have been up to no good. The takeover of Royal Mail by Czech billionaire Daniel Kretinsky has today been approved by the government. And it means that for the first time in its history, which dates back to 1516, under Henry VIII, Britain's postal service will be controlled by a foreign owner. Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds explained why the government gave its approval.
The agreement that we have reached means if that does go ahead, this would be a good deal for the UK, be a good deal for the people who work for Royal Mail, and of course it'd be a good deal for the customers. It actually strengthens the protections that we have, increases what was in place following the privatisation of Royal Mail with a golden share for the UK government, covering things like the business being headquartered in the UK and paying tax here. So it's for shareholders to approve the deal or not, but if it does go ahead, we have negotiated something which secures the long-term future of Royal Mail and gives it the fresh start that we need.
So as Jonathan Reynolds said there, the sale of Royal Mail is a decision for its shareholders to make, as it has been privatised since 2013. But in exchange for approving the sale, that's what the government got to do, Labour have extracted some obligations from Daniel Kretinsky. This is from the BBC. The government will retain a so-called golden share that will require it to approve any major changes to Royal Mail's ownership, HQ location and tax residency. EP Groups, that's the company buying Royal Mail, will also have to maintain the one price goes anywhere universal service obligation, which currently means it has to deliver letters 6 days per week, Monday to Saturday, and parcels Monday to Friday. The company is committed to maintaining the USO for as long as it owns Royal Mail. So the USO, the Universal Service Obligation, is set by Ofcom and determines what service Royal Mail has to deliver. It's up for review next year, and to save money, Royal Mail's new owners will want it to be significantly relaxed or scaled back. Ofcom's chief executive spoke to the BBC this morning about how she would approach those negotiations.
I think there are real questions about what the service needs to be going into the future. As you probably know, Ofcom's been opening those up over the last year because none of us use the letter service as much as we used to. It's still very important, but as the numbers go down, we have to think about what is economical and how many days a week, for example, we can still have that second-class letter delivery. And so we will be coming forward next year with proposals to make sure that it is sustainable. And then absolutely, we will hold Royal Mail to account for delivering whatever that final outcome is.
So Royal Mail has been taken over by a foreign billionaire, or is about to be taken over by a foreign billionaire, and Ofcom looks set to allow the new owners to scale back its service to save money. And presumably that would mean cutting jobs. Now, this all means you might predict or might expect the trade union representing Royal Mail workers to be up in arms. But after the deal was struck, the General Secretary of the CWU, Dave Ward, said this: the negotiators' agreement reached with EP Group over the Royal Mail is groundbreaking and unique in the private sector in the UK. It gives us the platform to rebuild Royal Mail. And he says he's looking forward to sharing the details with members of the CWU following our executives' debate and decision. So very sort of positive response. I caught up with Dave Ward earlier today to find out why the CWU are in fact welcoming this deal. And I should say first, a small disclaimer. I work for the CWU one day a week hosting their own live show for their members. So just to get that out there, but I do hope you'll judge this interview as fair.
Well, we have to consider the reality of where we are in a private company. We didn't want privatisation of Royal Mail. We didn't want liberalisation of Royal Mail services. But we also recognise that the company faces huge challenges going forward. You know, the world of communications has permanently changed, and the sector that our members work in now, in post in particular, is in structural decline. The other reason why we believe that this is the best option out of circumstances which we wouldn't have wanted is because we all know, you know, the reality of the current Royal Mail board is that they've basically created a situation where the status quo is just not sustainable. They've completely and systematically run down the company in recent years, run it into the ground. They failed customers and they failed postal workers. So in that scenario, at the point where a government decides that it's clearing this bid, our job is to get the best agreement we can. And we think the conditions of success for Royal Mail going forward are, one, you've got to get the workforce back on board. That's not going to happen under the current management. Two, you've got to have investment, and that's not going to happen under the current management. And three, we've got to try and grow the business. Now, we're not saying that this is what we wanted. What we're saying is that in the circumstances that we got to deal with, the reality of the world that we exist in, we believe with the government's agreement that gives them an ongoing involvement in Royal Mail that wasn't there before, and with our agreement that gives extensive job security protections, introduces a radically different business model for Royal Mail, of which workers and the unions will have a greater chance to sort of, you know, deliver a future direction that can rebuild the company.
Okay, so as far as I understand, Dave, your position seems to be, you know, it was already in private ownership. The previous owners, or the current owners, because obviously this sale hasn't completely gone through yet, the current owners haven't been good to work with. They haven't been providing a good service or treating your members well. I mean, you've reason to believe the new owner might be more effective or might be more amenable to sort of your priorities. I suppose an option, and what I imagine many of our viewers will be thinking of, is, isn't this a good time to really hammer for renationalisation? I'll read you a tweet from Jeremy Corbyn. So he says, the government could have finally brought Royal Mail into public ownership. It sold it to a Czech billionaire instead. We are being ripped off. It's time to put Royal Mail back where it belongs, in public hands. Now, I mean, some of our viewers might be surprised you don't seem to be echoing Jeremy Corbyn's demand there to renationalise Royal Mail. Why is that?
No, we're not in any different position to Jeremy in regard to we would want Royal Mail to be renationalised, but it is time to be very honest about whoever owned Royal Mail, those challenges in the future around, how can you grow the business when letters are in decline? They're going to be huge moments for whether the company was in government hands or whether it was in Mr. Kretinsky's hands. The point we're making is that there was no prospect of a UK government at this point in time doing that with all of the other issues and the financial issues that the country's facing. We have to make decisions based on what's in front of us now. And we actually believe that what is there now with the government taking a golden share and with an agreement where they've got lots of other protections against asset stripping, and our deal where there will be ongoing involvement of the government actually gives us the best platform to renationalise Royal Mail in the future.
And did you have a conversation with sort of Johnny Reynolds and the Labour Party where you said, what we'd really like you to do is renationalise it, and they said no? Or was that just sort of never a conversation that came up because you always saw it as being very unlikely?
We've been having that conversation, Michael, with the Labour Party pretty much for the last 5-6 years. Obviously, when Jeremy was the leader, he was willing to do that. The current leadership of the Labour Party don't want to go to that point. And like I keep saying, the difficulty is if you are in a private company, then things like takeover bids do come along. So the next best option for us is to see if we can create the circumstances where if Kretinsky doesn't play ball and doesn't deal with things in the right way, then the government are directly involved and we'll be holding the government to account at that point.
And does it make a difference? I suppose, there's a question of whether the Royal Mail's in private hands or public hands. Now, the other emotive issue is whether it's owned by a British owner or a foreign owner. I think that's why this is sort of making so many headlines. And actually why you might be seeing sort of people from across the political spectrum having sort of different worries about it. From the perspective of you, the union and your members, does it matter if Royal Mail's run by a British company or a Czech billionaire, sort of, or is that by the by for you?
I think if you acknowledge that the ownership is private at the moment and that takeovers happen, we wouldn't say that having British ownership or directors, which is what we got now, is actually a good option in the terms of the people that are running the company at the moment. Because, they may be British, but they've still run the company into the ground. With Mr. Kretinsky, we completely understand that our members, public and the country, there will be concerns. We've got concerns. But in terms of how you deal with these moments, you have to deal with the reality of that. And on a personal level, I don't want to sort of get into a debate here as though this is about, some sort of nationalistic debate, because the evidence of that is that the current owners, all British, in terms of, the ones who are running it, have done a disastrous job for our members, for the public, and for the future of Royal Mail.
And you've mentioned, whoever would own the industry, be it private, public, British, foreign, whoever, they're going to have a challenge, which is this is an industry which is in some ways in decline. I think it'd be obvious for our audience to see why that's the case. People used to send lots and lots of letters. Now email has replaced most situations where you would send a letter, so there's less to deliver. And as far as I understand, Royal Mail tends to be loss-making, or has been loss-making for a few of the past years. What is the future of the industry?
Well, this is the key point. Is that if we don't create growth in the industry, if we don't create more revenue in the company, then whether it's in private or public hands, because the world of communications has changed, and what I find, not with you guys, but with a lot of the media, they want to only recognise that point if we're taking strike action and they tell us we're anti-modernisation. It's been interesting to see the reaction from some media outlets today. And have been in that place, particularly the right-wing media, who don't want to sort of, own up to the fact that privatisation has failed. but have seemed to have also forgotten that the company faces huge challenges. I liken this to moments where the whole of your industry, and it happens across manufacturing, it happens across loads of other things, it is in a place where it's not sustainable purely delivering letters. And we've got to find replacements for that. And we think that the best chance of doing that is if you've got some investment in the workforce and the infrastructure. We've secured here some significant wins. So 20,000 workers when Royal Mail imposed new terms and conditions, inferior terms and conditions. We've now reached an agreement that will be removed, but it will be replaced by a new career path. That will take a bit of time to get the detail of that. But the first step to equalising the pay terms and conditions will be agreed within 3 months of them becoming the actual owner, because at the moment they've still got hurdles to overcome. And all I would say is that if you work in the industry, you know that these challenges are really, threatening the future of the company, whoever owns it. So we, once again, have to deal with that reality. And we think that if a company was to trust in the workforce a bit more, that we can develop different products and services that can add social value to Royal Mail. We've got lots of ideas about that and economic value to the country. And part of the deal is that we're going to agree a new growth plan within the next 6 months. I think you'll see some of that coming out, and that will give us a better chance to secure the future.
And just, in terms of the future, can you flesh that out a bit? Because, the amount of letters being sent isn't going to go back up, right? So the investment will have to be in a different part of the industry, presumably. You're talking parcels or something else?
So look, our view is that it's important that we retain letters, even though they're declining. There'll always be people who will send letters, and our job is to deliver those letters. What you've seen from the current board recently is price increases that are accelerating the decline. That shows what their intentions are. It's not to retain letters, it's to get rid of them. And the battle that we've had with the current board for the last 10 years is that they just want to turn Royal Mail into another parcel courier with self-employed workers. We've got commitments in this agreement under Kretinsky's ownership where, we're confident that we can avoid that and have avoided it in the past through disputes. We've just avoided it again going into the future. We can't guarantee forever that he's not going to come back and try those things. So what you need to grow is next day parcels. But that growth has to be with our members. We want to keep letters and parcels delivered together. And that's what this agreement gives us the chance to do. And the other area that I think is really interesting is that if you recognise that postal workers are one of the most trusted group of workers in the UK, even though they're not delivering as many letters, people like to see a postal worker coming down the street. We think that there are ideas, including how we might support the NHS in a different way, where that trust on the doorstep is used to the benefit of the whole country. What's crucial to that is that we keep the infrastructure of Royal Mail, which is something we believe Kretinsky understands that he's got to keep.
That was Dave Ward speaking to me earlier today. This morning, I was reminded of a man I hadn't thought about for a while, former Lib Dem MP and cheeky girl fiancé, Lembit Opik. Now, I was reminded of him because of this intriguing tweet. I went into Marks and Spencer's this evening and asked if their cheese contains the Bill Gates contaminant, Bovaer. They could not tell me. I advise all UK citizens to avoid M&S until they label those contaminated products with a warning, contains Bovaer. Now, the idea of a former Lib Dem MP and cheeky girl fiancé, Lembit Opik, demanding an M&S employee tell him whether their cheese contains an obscure Bill Gates supplement is inherently, somewhat curious to me, but it turns out a much deeper conspiracy underlies Opik's inquiries. And it's going viral on right-wing Twitter. This tweet from someone called Hustle Bitch has over 1 million views. Breaking, Nestle confirms full support to use Bovaer in its supply chain products. Bovaer is classified as a toxic drug in the US, not for human use, due to risks of infertility and cancer. Bill Gates' partner BlackRock are shareholders in the company who make this toxic drug. And the account Peter Sweden, has shared this. Share this video if you will be boycotting Arla and their Beauvais products this Christmas. He's got hundreds of thousands of followers. I think a fairly far-right account. According to this TikTok video, viewed 1 million times, that call for a boycott may have already been successful.
Look at this. The milk is selling, but when you get to Arla milk, this is all Arla milk. When you get to Arla milk, it is all completely compact. But you see the other milks, they're all selling. They're selling, but Arla is just, the milks with Arla on are just not selling. This is Sainsbury's, by the way. So we are winning.
So according to that TikToker, the campaign against Beauvais is winning. So should we be celebrating? Well, not according to the BBC. They have a piece titled, "Why Misinformation About a Cow Feed Additive Prompted People to Throw Away Milk." In the BBC article, they say this: Arla Foods, a Danish-Swedish company which owns the UK's biggest dairy cooperative, announced last week that 30 of its farms across the country would test the additive named Beauvais. The company behind Beauvais, which is added in small quantities to cow feed, says it could reduce cow methane emissions by between 30 to 45%. It has been approved for use by UK regulators, and several major supermarkets will stock milk produced by cattle eating feed with the additive. Some online users have raised concerns around the use of Beauvais, citing issues around the safety of certain compounds used in it. However, experts have told the BBC that the additive does not pose any food safety issues. So from that, I've gleaned Beauvais is an additive introduced into cow feed to reduce the amount of methane the cows produce. This is exactly the kind of story I like. Bit of cheapish technology, which that could have a big impact on the climate. We've got lots and lots of problems with cows releasing methane, that going up, and it's very, very intense global warming emission, much more powerful than carbon. But as you can tell, people are upset about this. So what is the beef? Well, the BBC explain. Opponents of the additive have pointed to a report by the FSA last year, which found that free NOP, which is another word for this chemical, should be considered corrosive to the eyes, a skin irritant, and potentially harmful by inhalation to humans handling it. But experts emphasise that no traces of Beauvais or the compounds contained within it would be found in milk or other produce, as it is broken down in a cow's stomach. So as far as I can tell, not that much to worry about. Ash, I went with this story because I want to do a bit more sort of like, positive developments on this show, as well as just terrible things happening everywhere. This is a kind of climate tech story I like. Cheap additive, you give it to the cow, they produce way less methane, really good for the climate. Obviously, lots of viewers will say, well, we should just eat less beef. We should just eat less beef, but it's very, very difficult to get people to change their diets. Not that hard to put an additive in the food so that the cows burp or fart less. However, big backlash from right-wingers, apparently. Will you be drinking milk? Well, it's not even containing Beauvais. Will you be drinking milk which was excreted by cows who ate feed with this supplement in it?
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that I would feel comfortable because my attitude to a lot of this stuff is like, well, the UK generally has got a fairly well-regulated food safety culture. That's obviously something that the Tories wanted to change in order for us to have a closer trading relationship with the US post-Brexit, but generally quite good. So I personally would feel comfortable. However, I think the more interesting thing, and perhaps the more important thing to talk about, is why people don't, and why this is an issue which does, so you're talking about it in terms of right-wing Twitter accounts and influencers, but it's one of those things which is able to sort of cut across right and left and actually becomes a mechanism for taking people from the left over to the right, because the right wing take ownership of this particular issue. I mean, you've seen that with RFK Jr. Now, there's some really good reasons for people to be suspicious and skeptical and wary of what goes into food supply chains, particularly in the United States, where there are all sorts of additives which have been approved for use in food supply chains, which are not allowed in the EU or in the UK for very, very good reasons. That's one of the main things that RFK Jr. has spent his career campaigning on. So whenever something happens in the US political context, it does have an effect of becoming a talking point elsewhere, even in contexts where it's perhaps not relevant. So that's the first thing, which is that I think that these are talking points which are developed in the US, where you have really, really, really good reasons to think that things which are approved by the FDA aren't necessarily going to be good for humans, because the FDA has a long history of approving stuff for human consumption, whether it's in a food or a medical context where it really shouldn't. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think that there is something deeply visceral about um, things that we eat and things that go into supply chains. And the fact that these decisions don't seem to be being made by those who we would trust. It's interesting that so much of what we consume is made by kind of either like big industrial producers of food or huge agribusinesses, and we do not trust them instinctively. We do not trust them the way that we would small scale farmers. All right. We do not think that these, kind of massive agribusinesses or massive corporations are operating in our interests. And again, some good reasons to think that. I mean, you think about, Monsanto, genetically modified seeds. I'm not saying that they've got health consequences necessarily, but these are seeds which have been engineered um, so that one, farmers can't use them year to year. Like, these won't be plants which reproduce themselves, which means that you always have to buy more from Monsanto. And also, they've protected their intellectual property to the extent that, if some seeds get blown in the wind onto a neighbor's field, that they'll be sued for IP infringement. I mean, kind of that's how crazy it is. So again, good reasons to mistrust companies such as these. And then I think there's also something, and this is me doing a bit of vibes-based analysis, Michael. I hope you don't mind. But my vibes-based analysis is this, which is I think that people can see and experience and, are first-hand witnesses to the ways in which our food production, the things we eat, the way it makes us unwell. So the availability of red meat, processed meat, that's had a consequence, which is increasing rates of bowel cancer. And bowel cancer is, I mean, really awful, really, really painful. Um, just absolutely terrible. And that's a consequence of what kinds of food have been made more available, particularly because of, like I said, these kind of like big industrial supply chains of meat. Another is the kind of declining fertility rate. Now, there's lots of social reasons for that: changes to the age at which people have children, the age at which, in particular, women start trying, and then there is the sort of sense, and again, big talking point on the right about things like sperm counts and sperm motility, which people have been ascribing to pollution, microplastics, changes in people's diets as well. Um, so yeah, I think that there is a sense that people are becoming sort of suspicious and untrusting and wary of what goes into the food supply chain. There are some very good reasons for that, and it's quite easy to take a target which may be innocuous, like this particular additive, and make it a flashpoint, because it's becoming a sort of scapegoat for all of these broader anxieties.
I mean, I see where you're coming from. I think you make good points, but also to me, the backlash here, and I sort of GB News have done a segment on it as well, is specifically because this, there are so many supplements in our food, right? And lots of them, there is evidence that they are sort of problematic for our health. It doesn't seem to me that there's any evidence whatsoever that this chemical which you put in cow's feed, which breaks up, I think it sort of makes the enzymes work a bit differently in the stomach. So when it's breaking down the grass, it doesn't create quite as much methane. I haven't seen anyone suggest that there is actually any real health problem with this, but it just so happens that it's a kind of technology that could be helpful for the climate, which is why Bill Gates has invested not in this particular company, but in a competitor that's also sort of dealing with this. And so I think it's not just that there's a backlash against the food industry or agribusiness. I agree with you. There's lots to sort of critique agribusiness for, but there is a sort of right-wing backlash against any kind of technology which could be seen as useful for combating climate change. I know Lembit Opik, who we sort of started this segment, I was going through his Twitter today. He's got lots of tweets sort of doubting climate change is even caused by carbon dioxide and human activity. So I feel like I agree with you. This is a lot of the sort of MAHA, Make America Healthy Again, RFK Jr. type stuff, but with a massive intersection alongside climate denialism. And I think there is going to be sort of like a big future for those kind of movements. And so sort of, I'm more inclined to just say, let's reject these guys and not have any sort of public policy based on them. I don't know. What do you think?
What, as in reject the sort of MAHA crowd?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I feel like you're sort of giving them a bit of credence, sort of like maybe they've got a bit of a point here. And I think this is coming from much more of a sort of climate backlash reactionary place.
Well, I think what you're seeing here is a sort of dovetailing, right? So ultimately, if you're a kind of, hedge fund financed, right winger, or like, set of think tanks or, people whose job it is to sort of come up with like political lines which can undermine the fight against climate change, you're obviously going to look for opportunities, right? You're going to look for any opportunity you can. And so looking at something where you go, all right, there's some like quite legitimate points here. What if we can take something which has traditionally been a left-wing position, right? Which is sort of, opposition to, big, corporate agribusinesses and, taking a stance against things like GM food. What if you take something which has been traditionally associated with the left and we redirect it to our cause? All right, like that, it's the job of those ideological operators to look for those opportunities. The point I'm making is that the reason why there is such an opportunity is because I think there's something legitimate there. And one of the problems I think for, and I'm pointing at myself here, when you point a finger, there's three pointing back at you, so this is an occasion where three fingers are pointing back at me. I'm someone who I think, in part, due to my class position, I have a feeling of trust towards those who say, I'm a doctor, I'm a scientist. I have feelings of trust towards them, right? I trust people who also come from a professional middle class background, right? There are other people who do not feel the same way. And you saw this with the vaccine, right? Well, just because you're saying that and you say you're a doctor or you're saying you're a scientist, that doesn't mean I trust you. I don't trust you with this thing that feels very visceral, right? Again, something that goes into my body. And you've got that sort of set of people who, like, in a way, part of the reason why kind of, left-wing or progressive arguments become less convincing is because we're appealing to a sort of deference to experts and a deference to certain professions, which doesn't resonate with them. So I guess I'm saying, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm not disagreeing with you that this sort of, a right-wing climate skeptic thing is operating here. The reason why I'm saying that there is such an opportunity for them is that, one, the arguments we make trying to persuade people are not landing because they often really, really rest on like expert testimony, right? Experts who don't have the same kind of currency. And again, some good reasons for that, some good reasons to mistrust experts as well. And sort of secondly, because that terrain around food and what goes into food has been sort of like gradually like either abandoned or just given less prominence by the left, liberals and progressives.
No, it's such an interesting debate. There's a BBC documentary at the moment, isn't there, or online one about a Diary of a CEO and whether or not he's spreading misinformation when it comes to sort of health and food. And I think there are sort of very two different positions, which is to say, yes, sort of like a populist left position is to say you're right to distrust the experts, but let's take this down a slightly different route. And then there's the more sort of like, actually, we really need people to trust the experts to deal with a bunch of challenges like climate change. Super interesting. Clarissa Ward is CNN's chief international correspondent, and she's built a career out of being on the scene when historic moments occur. She covered the execution of Saddam Hussein, was embedded with the US military in Iraq, and covered the Taliban's retaking of Kabul. And her reporting is often very dramatic.
Close in.
Down.
Close. Get down. Close.
Fine.
You're fine. You're okay. You're all right.
Okay.
That's the Iron Dome. Okay. That's the Iron Dome.
Yeah.
Fine.
Clarissa is on the ground right now. Clarissa, tell us what's happening.
Stand by.
Hi, John. So forgive me, I have a slightly unelegant position, but we have just had a massive barrage of rockets coming in here, not too far from us. So we have had to take shelter here.
Now, that video was actually subject to sort of conspiracy theories of its own because someone was sharing on Twitter a version of it where they'd overdubbed on the audio someone telling her to get down for the sake of the news report. In fact, that was fake. There was no evidence that that was fake, but it's very, very dramatic. It did seem like something from a movie. But even for a journalist who is no stranger to high-octane moments, last week Clarissa Ward was involved in something especially extraordinary, and that was even by her own account. So she tweeted, "In nearly 20 years as a journalist, this was one of the most extraordinary moments I have witnessed." And the report was this one, filmed at an empty prison beneath Syria's Air Force Intelligence Headquarters.
I can't tell though, it might just be a blanket, but it's the only cell that's locked. Is he gonna shoot it?
The guard makes us turn the camera off while he shoots the lock off the cell door. We go in to get a closer look. It's still not clear if there is something under the blanket.
Oh, it moved. Is there someone there? I thought I saw it move. Is someone there? Or is it just a blanket? I don't know.
I think it's someone. Hello?
Okay, it's just moving.
Yeah. Oh.
I'm a civilian, he says. I'm a civilian.
It's okay. It's okay. It's okay.
He tells the fighter he's from the city of Homs and has been in the cell for 3 months.
Okay.
Okay, you're okay. You're okay. You're okay. You're okay.
Now, many people sort of on social media after that was shared pointed out that guy looked, fairly healthy for someone who's been in a torture prison for 3 months, right? Saying he hadn't seen any light, hadn't had any food or water. I mean, as the piece pointed out, he was the only prisoner left in a centre that had been emptied out. So one prisoner who looks, relatively well for someone who's supposedly been locked alone in prison for months, might have raised some suspicions. None of it, though, did appear to raise suspicions with those CNN journalists.
Thank God you are safe. Don't be afraid, the fighter says. You are free. This is the third prison they brought me to, he says. The third prison. After 3 months in a windowless cell, he can finally see the sky. My God, the light, he says. Oh God, there is light. My God, there is light. Okay.
You're okay.
Stay with me, stay with me, he repeats again and again. For 3 months, I didn't know anything about my family. I didn't hear anything about my children. The fighter hands him something to eat. He can barely lift it to his mouth. But his body can't handle it.
Okay, you're okay.
So the CNN story is that they discovered the last prisoner in one of Assad's secret prisons, freeing an innocent victim of the regime before he succumbed to hunger alone in an otherwise empty prison. Now, quite an amazing moment. Except it's beginning to look suspect if it didn't before. Verify Psy is a Syrian fact-checking organization set up in 2016. Its mission is to counter misinformation coming out of Syria. It's affiliated with the International Fact-Checking Network. They've now investigated Ward's discovery, and they say the veteran journalist may have been had. In the video, the prisoner identified himself as Adel Garbal from Homs. Verify Psy reports on that claim. The Verify Psy team searched public records for the name Adel Garbal to verify the circumstances and duration of his detention, but found no results. Garbal, who claimed to hail from Oms and whose dialect supported this claim, prompted further inquiries in the city. The team discovered that his real name is Salama Mohammed Salama, a revelation that brought shocking details to light. Here are some of those details. So they say Salama, known as Abu Hamza, is a first lieutenant in Syrian Air Force intelligence, notorious for his activities in Homs. Residents of the Al-Bayada neighborhood identified him as frequently stationed at a checkpoint in the area's western entrance, infamous for its abuses. Abu Hamza reportedly managed several security checkpoints in Homs and was involved in theft, extortion, and coercing residents into becoming informants. According to locals, his recent incarceration, lasting less than a month, was due to a dispute over profit sharing from extorted funds with a higher-ranking officer. This led to his detention in one of Damascus's cells, as per neighborhood sources. And the report goes on to reveal this. Despite his seemingly innocent and composed demeanor in the CNN report, Salama has a grim history. He participated in military operations on several fronts in Homs in 2014, killed civilians, and was responsible for detaining and torturing numerous young men in the city without cause or on fabricated charges. Many were targeted simply for refusing to pay bribes, rejecting cooperation, or even for arbitrary reasons like their appearance. These details were corroborated by families of victims and former detainees who spoke with Verify Psy. Now, that's pretty embarrassing for CNN and one of its most senior journalists if it turns out to be true. It would mean that either they participated in spreading misinformation or fell victim to it. And 2 days after Ward's video went out, meaning she'd had plenty of time to do some fact-checking, she was still standing by her story and posting this online. It shows the man from the video, potentially, we now know, an Assad regime officer with Red Crescent workers. And Ward writes, the man from our report reunited with a family member. CNN, though, is taking the accusations seriously. The network is now investigating the background of the prisoner freed in Ward's video and admits he may have given a false identity. And CNN has said this about the accusations. No one other than the CNN team was aware of our plans to visit the prison building featured in our report that day. The events transpired as they appear in our film. The decision to release the prisoner featured in our report was taken by the guard, a Syrian rebel. We reported the scene as it unfolded, including what the prisoner told us with clear attribution. We have subsequently been investigating his background and are aware that he may have given a false identity. We are continuing our reporting into this and the wider story. It is true that throughout the video, Ward's voiceover makes clear that she's just translating the man's words, just saying this is what he said. So in other words, she is technically reporting the scene as it unfolds. Of course, though, it's those accompanying images, Ward looking shocked, helping the man to walk out of the prison and keeping herself and her emotions permanently in shot, that really tells the story she wanted to tell. Ash, in a way, sort of when I first saw the video, my suspicion wasn't just that this man had given a false identity, but the whole thing looked a bit set up, right? It looked as if sort of if you're a rebel, you might want, you want to put forward that Assad was really brutal. You want to help basically these Western media figures get as dramatic a footage as possible. And to me, it seemed like they had probably a bit of a shared interest in, the Syrians maybe setting it up and CNN not colluding with them, but kind of not being as critical as they could be because they knew it would be great footage. What these fact checkers seem to have come up with is a slightly different story, that he actually was a prisoner, but he was a prisoner who had been on Assad's side and had done some terrible things and had lied to CNN about his identity. What do you make of this whole row?
Michael, now, first, because this is an important journalistic practice, I need to say up top, I am not telepathic. I'm not telepathic. But I feel I could see inside this woman's head. All right. I could feel that Clarissa Ward, as she was expressing her shock, and she was saying, "You're okay." And she was, kind of centered, but sort of off center. And this man's incredible emotional reaction was on camera for all to see. She was in her head going, who is going to win the Oscar for playing me when they turn this into a movie? Is it going to be Cate Blanchett, or are we going to see Angelina Jolie make a return to Hollywood and playing that sort of, very resilient Westerner in the Middle East character that we know that she used to like to play in her heyday. Back when she was adopting all them ethnic minority kids, that was the kind of role Angelina Jolie would play. I really did feel that from her, that she was like, wow, what a moment. And I think that this speaks to an important conversation about journalistic bias. When we talk about journalistic bias, often what we talk about is ideological bias. We talk about partisanship. And of course, that's important. Journalism is, always a means of a kind of propaganda, right? And it can be entirely factual, but the selection of facts or the pursuit of certain stories over others, there's always ideology there. I think that you can be fair and accurate in your handling of facts, but I don't think that journalists can be objective or impartial, no matter how hard they try. Right? That's what I think. They can work to mitigate those biases, but they can never really get rid of them. So normally we're talking about ideological biases. We're talking about political sympathies. We're talking about partisanship. But there is another kind of bias which is equally important, and that bias is, how much do I want this to be true because it advances my career, or it presents an image of myself as a certain kind of journalist. And I think that that's something which all journalists, including myself, are vulnerable to, because there's always ego at work, or particularly when you do a job which involves your face being on camera, there is ego there, and you have to work against it. Now, what's interesting to me isn't so much that, Clarissa Ward, superstar journalist, may have had her work warped by ego in that kind of way. It's actually the way in which others, potentially, this guy here, are able to detect the sort of narcissism, egoism, messianic fantasies that journalists have and exploit it very, very quickly. That's something which is fascinating to me, that journalists are unaware of their vulnerability, their weakness, their ability to be exploited or manipulated, but others are not. And I think it does sort of fit with something that I know of journalists. And again, point a finger, there's three pointing back at you, right? My ego makes me vulnerable to manipulation as well. But something which I have seen from journalists is that they love things which make them look important and at the center of things. Now, sometimes this can be so minor that it's basically risible. I mean, I remember when Sajid Javid was, forced into resigning because of, certain power struggles of Dominic Cummings. When the news was breaking, he had Laura Koonsberg on the phone, and the BBC were filming her being on the phone going like, can we get confirmation of that? Because it made her look really busy and important. And I was like, at the end of the day, this woman's on the fucking phone. I mean, come on, like it's hardly war reporting. And then the BBC put that clip out, and then you had, I can't remember if it was Newscast or Brexit Cast or one of the casts kind of like commenting on it. I was just like, wow, this really is just a culture that's high on its own farts. But in a much bigger way, I think you saw that playing out, which is a journalist who wanted something to be true because it put her at the center of the story in a way which made her look heroic and brave and, like I said, like a little bit, of a savior. That meant that in those 2 days between the footage being shot and the footage being distributed, there is an active disincentive to do the fact checking. Because if the story that you discovered was, hang on, this guy was pretending to be someone he wasn't in order to manipulate my emotions, it's an incredible story, I think. And I think on its own, it's a fascinating story, but it's one which cuts against you being an excellent journalist, and maybe makes you look, I can't remember the word is, gullible, right? It makes you look a bit gullible. So there's an active disincentive to do the due diligence and the fact-checking work, because it undermines the image of you, the journalist, that you want to present in the story.
And I suppose she probably, when she was doing the voiceover, she probably knew that she was covering her back by saying, he said this, he said that, even though she knew that the power of the video come from her portraying it as this being a genuine interaction with a genuine person. Ash, a pleasure being joined by you for the last hour or so. Apologies for how long we talked about milk.
Who would play me, Michael? That's what I want to know. Who would play me and who would play you?
Ooh. Tell us in the comments.
Scarlett Johansson.
Yeah, I think Scarlett Johansson, and I'll be Idris Elba. Thank you everyone for watching tonight. We've been Novara Media. If you want to support our work, do go to novaramedia.com/support and come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.